Hey guys, welcome back to Sleep into Power. I am NJ. So have you ever wondered if there comes a point in the accumulation of power when speaking becomes more expensive than silence? When almost anything you say can move a market, alter a negotiation, reveal an intention, create an enemy, attract attention, or expose a weakness, communication itself begins to change shape. It stops being a simple exchange between two people and becomes something closer to a transaction, with a price attached to every sentence. The ordinary person usually speaks in order to be understood. The powerful person often stays quiet, precisely because they understand how much a single sentence gives away. And somewhere in the space between wealth, psychology, and influence, silence stops being emptiness. It becomes strategy. Tonight we are going to sit with a question that has followed money and power for as long as both have existed. Why do some of the world's wealthiest and most influential people become so difficult to read? Why do they speak less as they acquire more? Why do the rooms they occupy grow quieter rather than louder? And what happens, psychologically, to a human being who slowly discovers that saying nothing has become one of the most valuable things they can do? This is not a story about secrets. It is a story about restraint, about attention, about information, and about what it costs a person to become someone whose every word is worth something to somebody else. If you enjoy these long journeys through psychology, history, philosophy, and the hidden forces that shape our world, consider subscribing to Sleep into Power. If you would rather listen than watch, you will find Sleep into Power on Spotify, and there is a companion channel, Meditate into Power, for the nights when you want something gentler and more meditative. There is also the Sleep into Power book, available on Amazon in paperback and on Kindle, for anyone who wants to go deeper into the philosophy behind all of this. And if you would like to support the channel directly, you can do that through Buy Me a Coffee. All of those links are waiting quietly in the description below. Thank you to the listener who suggested tonight's subject. You know who you are, and wherever you happen to be listening from tonight, whatever hour it is in your part of the world, whether the sun has only just gone down or morning is already gathering at the edge of your window, thank you for being here. Get comfortable. Let the outside world become a little quieter, and let us explore the psychology behind the silence of the world's wealthiest and most powerful people. Begin with something ordinary, a conversation between two strangers at a party. Nothing is at stake. Nobody is negotiating. And yet within 4 or 5 minutes, an extraordinary amount of information has already changed hands. One of them has mentioned where they work, which reveals income bracket, education, sector, and probably political leaning. One of them has complained about a colleague, which reveals what irritates them and therefore how they might be irritated deliberately. One of them has mentioned a holiday, which reveals disposable income. One has mentioned a child, which reveals a vulnerability, a schedule, a set of obligations, and a lever. One has said something slightly too enthusiastically, which reveals what they want other people to think about them. None of this was intended. This is simply what happens when human beings talk. Speech is not just a way of transmitting ideas. It is a continuous, largely unconscious broadcast of preference, insecurity, ambition, and fear. For most of us, that broadcast costs almost nothing. Nobody is listening closely enough to profit from it. Our opinions do not move share prices. Our frustrations do not end careers. Our stray remarks are forgotten before the taxi arrives home. But imagine, for a moment, that the broadcast has value. Imagine that somewhere in the room, there is a person who is calculating what your words are worth. Imagine that a comment about being tired of a particular business could be repeated, tomorrow, to someone preparing to buy that business. Imagine that a mild expression of interest in a piece of land raises the price of that land by the end of the week. Under those conditions, a person does not become secretive, they become expensive. This is the first and simplest layer of the phenomenon, silence as information control. It requires no mysticism and no conspiracy. It follows almost mechanically from the fact that information has value and that speech distributes information for free. Negotiation researchers have understood this for a long time. In any bargaining situation, the party who reveals their preferences first has surrendered something. They have shown their reservation price, their time pressure, their enthusiasm, their alternatives. The other party can then organize their entire approach around that knowledge, which is why so much of professional negotiation training focuses not on eloquence, but on withholding, on the discipline of asking rather than declaring, on the strange power of allowing another person to go first. And people do go first, reliably, almost helplessly, because a silence in a conversation feels, to the human nervous system, like a small emergency. There is real research on this. The linguist Tanya Stivers and her colleagues published a study in 2009 examining conversational turn-taking across 10 languages spoken on 5 continents, from English and Italian to Japanese, Korean, Danish, Dutch and Lao, including a click language spoken in Namibia. What they found was remarkably consistent. Across cultures that share almost nothing else, the gap between one speaker finishing and the next beginning tends to hover around 0.2 of a second. There is cultural variation, of course, but the underlying rhythm is startlingly universal, which suggests it is not merely a social convention, but something close to a species-level expectation. 0.2 of a second, that is the window in which we expect a reply. Anything longer starts to register as meaningful. The Dutch social psychologist Namke Kudenberg and her colleagues took this further in 2011. They studied what happens when a conversation is disrupted by a pause of roughly 4 seconds. Not an argument, not a disagreement, simply a gap. And they found that even this brief interruption in conversational flow left participants feeling less accepted, less connected, and less certain of their standing in the group. Silence, in other words, is not neutral. It is experienced almost physically as a threat to belonging, which explains a great deal about why silence works. If a 4-second pause makes an ordinary person feel socially unsafe, then the person who can sit inside that pause without discomfort holds a genuine asymmetry. They are not doing anything clever. They are simply declining to relieve someone else's anxiety. And that anxiety, left alone, will usually go looking for something to fill itself with. Words, explanations, concessions, additional information that nobody asked for. We will return to that, because it becomes very important later. For now, hold on to the basic principle. Conversation is a leak. Under ordinary circumstances, the leak is harmless. As the stakes rise, the leak becomes a liability. And people whose stakes have risen enormously tend, sooner or later, to notice. Something else happens on the way up, and it is stranger and lonelier than the first thing. The world starts wanting. Consider what happens to the texture of ordinary social life when a person becomes seriously wealthy. Not comfortable, not successful. Wealthy in the way that appears in lists and databases and newspaper profiles. Every dinner invitation now carries a second layer. Every introduction contains a possibility. Every old friend who calls after 11 years has a reason for calling. Not necessarily a bad reason, perhaps a perfectly warm and human reason. But the ambiguity is permanent, and it cannot be resolved. Can you invest? Can you introduce me? Can you fund this? Can you take a look at my deck? Can my nephew intern at your company? Can you come to the fundraiser? Can we use your name? Can I borrow the house in August? Can you say a few words at the launch? Can you have a quick coffee with someone who would really value your time? None of these requests is unreasonable in isolation. Collectively, they change the meaning of every human interaction a person has, because now a question sits underneath every conversation, and it can never quite be answered. Does this person like me, or do they like what proximity to me provides? Psychologists studying attribution have long known how difficult it is for any of us to determine the true motives behind another person's warmth. We are, at best, mediocre at it. We overtrust people we find attractive, articulate, or similar to ourselves. We undertrust people who seem different, and we have almost no reliable method for distinguishing sincere affection from strategic affection, particularly when the strategic version is sincere too, which it very often is. People can genuinely like you and genuinely want something from you at the same time. That combination is not hypocrisy. It is simply how human relationships work when resources are involved. But when the resource is enormous, the ambiguity becomes exhausting, and exhaustion produces caution. Not paranoia necessarily. Caution. A slight delay before answering. A slight vagueness about plans. A slight reluctance to express enthusiasm, because enthusiasm is expensive. If a wealthy person says at dinner that they love a particular restaurant, someone may buy the building. If they mention admiring a young founder, that founder's valuation may move. If they express irritation with a chief executive, that irritation will be repeated within days, and it will arrive at its destination distorted. So the wealthy person learns to say less, not because they have become cold, but because their words have become heavier than they used to be, and they have begun to feel the weight. There is a psychological term that fits loosely here, borrowed from research on self-presentation. The sociologist Irving Goffman described social life in his 1959 work on the presentation of self as a kind of theater with a front stage and a backstage. The front stage is where we perform. The backstage is where we drop the performance and become recognizably ourselves. What wealth and visibility do, gradually, is shrink the backstage. The dinner is front stage. The charity gala is front stage. The board meeting is front stage. The flight is front stage, because the crew talk. The hotel is front stage, because staff have phones. The old friend is front stage, because old friends have podcasts now. Even the family can become front stage, in ways that are painful to admit. And when the backstage shrinks to almost nothing, silence becomes the only remaining private room. Which brings us to the paradox at the center of modern wealth. Money can purchase almost anything. It can purchase time, comfort, healthcare, education, security, beauty, distance, and legal protection. It can purchase a version of freedom that most people will never experience. But there is one thing it becomes progressively worse at purchasing as the amount increases, and that thing is anonymity. The moderately wealthy person is invisible. The extremely wealthy person is a subject of public interest. Their name appears in filings. Their holdings appear in registries. Their divorces appear in courts. Their houses appear in planning applications. Their faces appear in photographs taken by strangers who did not ask. And so a curious inversion occurs. At lower levels of wealth, luxury means being seen in the right places. At higher levels, luxury frequently means not being seen at all. Think about what the infrastructure of extreme wealth actually does beneath the surface glamour. A private jet is often described as a symbol of excess, and sometimes it is exactly that. But functionally, for many who use them, it is a device for avoiding 200 strangers with cameras. A gated estate is not merely a display of scale. It is a mechanism for controlling who can approach. A private members club with no sign on the door is not being coy for aesthetic reasons. It is filtering. An assistant who manages a calendar is not simply an administrative convenience. That person is a permeable membrane deciding what reaches the center and what does not. Read this way. A great deal of what looks like consumption is actually architecture. Architecture for the control of access. And access, not money, becomes the real currency at the top. Perhaps the ultimate luxury is not being unseen. It is deciding when you are seen. That distinction matters because it separates hiding from choosing. The person hiding is afraid. The person choosing is exercising a form of sovereignty over their own visibility that almost nobody in the modern world possesses anymore. Most of us are visible by default and private by effort. At a certain altitude, that arrangement reverses. Privacy becomes the default state, purchased and maintained at considerable expense, and visibility becomes the deliberate act. You can hear this reversal in the way such people describe their own decisions. Appearing on a stage becomes a choice with a strategic rationale. Giving an interview becomes a calculated release. Even a photograph becomes an event rather than an accident. There is something both enviable and slightly sad in it. Enviable, because control over one's own exposure is a genuine form of freedom in an age of relentless observation. Sad, because it means spontaneity has been quietly removed from a life. The unplanned conversation with a stranger, the ordinary anonymity of walking through a city and being nobody in particular, the freedom to be badly dressed and unobserved in a supermarket at 9 in the evening. These are things most of us possess without noticing, and they are among the very few things that money reliably takes away. Somewhere in this transformation, another change takes place, and this one happens inside the person rather than around them. The cost of reacting goes up. For most of us, an impulsive response is cheap. We snap at someone in traffic, send a slightly sharp message, complain about a colleague in a moment of frustration, and the consequences are contained within a small circle of people who will mostly forgive us. The damage is real but survivable. Raise the stakes, and this arithmetic changes completely. A chief executive who responds angrily to criticism creates a news cycle. An investor who expresses irritation publicly moves a share price. A public figure who fires off a message at 1 in the morning creates a permanent artifact that will be screenshotted, archived, and produced as evidence in a courtroom or a documentary years later. So people in these positions tend, over time, to develop something psychologists call emotional regulation. It is one of the most studied constructs in the whole of behavioral science, and it is frequently misunderstood. Emotional regulation does not mean feeling less. The research is fairly clear on this point. James Gross at Stanford spent decades mapping how people manage emotional responses, and one of his central findings concerns the difference between two strategies. The first is suppression, where a person feels something intensely and simply refuses to show it. The second is reappraisal, where a person reinterprets the situation before the emotional response fully forms. Suppression is expensive. It costs cognitive resources. It tends to increase physiological arousal rather than reduce it. And in Gross's studies, it was associated with poorer social outcomes and reduced well-being. Reappraisal is comparatively cheap and tends to be associated with better outcomes. The distinction is worth sitting with, because it separates two very different kinds of quiet person. One kind is boiling underneath and holding the lid down by force. That person is not calm. They are performing calm at considerable internal cost, and the cost accumulates. The other kind has genuinely changed how they interpret the provocation. The insult has not been swallowed. It has been reclassified as something not worth a response, in the way that most adults no longer feel personally wounded when a small child tells them they are stupid. From the outside, both look identical. Both are silent. But the internal experience is entirely different, and so are the long-term consequences. There is a related idea that appears constantly in discussions of wealth and self-control, and it deserves a careful handling because it has been distorted almost beyond recognition. The marshmallow experiments, conducted by Walter Mischel and his colleagues at Stanford beginning in the late 1960s, offered young children a choice between one treat immediately or two treats if they could wait. Follow-up studies reported correlations between the ability to delay and various later life outcomes, and the finding entered popular culture as a simple parable about willpower producing success. The story has since become considerably more complicated. A larger and more diverse replication led by Tyler Watts, Greg Duncan, and Haonan Kwan, published in 2018, found that the association between delay and later outcomes was much weaker once family background, home environment, and early cognitive ability were taken into account. The capacity to wait, it turned out, was substantially predicted by whether a child had grown up in circumstances where waiting reliably paid off, which is a genuinely interesting finding in the context of tonight's subject. Patience is not purely a virtue distributed at random. It is also, in part, a product of an environment stable enough to make patience rational. A person who has learned that promised rewards usually arrive will wait. A person who has learned that they usually do not will take the treat now, and they will be behaving perfectly sensibly. Wealth, among many other things, is a machine for making patience rational. Hold that thought too. It will return when we discuss the darker consequences of all this. But whatever its origins, the capacity to delay a response has an obvious application, and it appears most vividly in the one arena where silence has been studied as a deliberate instrument: the negotiation. There is a moment familiar to anyone who has sat across a table from someone with more experience than themselves. A number has been proposed, and instead of a counteroffer, instead of an argument, instead of any response at all, the other person simply looks at you and says nothing. 3 seconds pass. 4, 5, and you begin to talk. You explain how you arrived at the number. You mention that there is some flexibility. You describe your reasoning, which reveals your priorities. You mention a deadline you had not intended to mention. Within 30 seconds, you have negotiated against yourself with impressive efficiency, and the other party has not said a single word. This is not folklore. Jared Kurhan at MIT, together with colleagues including Jennifer Overbeck, Yeri Cho, Teng Zhang, and Yu Yang, published research in the Journal of Applied Psychology in 2022, examining what actually happens when silence occurs during negotiation. Analyzing recorded negotiations and running controlled experiments, they found that periods of silence lasting at least 3 seconds were associated with a reduction in reflexive, reactive behavior, and with an increase in deliberative thinking. Silence, in their data, was linked to better value creation for both sides, rather than simply extraction by the quieter party. That last detail matters enormously, and it is the reason this documentary is not a manual for manipulation. The finding was not that silence lets you defeat people. It was that silence interrupts the automatic ping-pong quality of ordinary bargaining, in which each side reacts to the last statement rather than thinking about the actual problem. The pause creates room for reflection, and reflection tends to produce better agreements. The advantage is real, but it is not primarily an advantage over the other person. It is an advantage over one's own reflexes. There is a version of this that is genuinely predatory, and it should be named clearly: deliberately weaponizing another person's discomfort, letting them squirm, using silence to extract concessions from someone who cannot afford them, is a recognizable technique, and it is used. It appears in property negotiations, in employment discussions, in situations where one party has a great deal of practice and the other has none. It works, in the short term. It also produces resentment, damaged relationships, and counterparties who will never deal with you again if they can avoid it, which, in a world where the same names circulate through the same rooms for 40 years, is an expensive way to win. The more interesting form of negotiating silence is not the ambush, it is the absence of urgency. There is a particular quality to negotiating with someone who genuinely does not need the deal. They are not performing indifference, they are indifferent, in the specific sense that a perfectly good alternative exists, and both parties know it. Such a person does not need to fill silences, because they are not anxious. They are not anxious because they have options, which suggests something important, and slightly deflating for anyone hoping that quietness alone is a superpower. The silence is usually not producing the power is producing the silence. Consider the same principle at work in a completely different arena, where it is even more visible. Somebody says something untrue about you in public. The immediate, near-universal human response is to correct it. The urge is almost physical. There is a version of events circulating in the minds of other people that does not match reality, and something in us finds that condition intolerable. We want to explain. We want to produce evidence. We want the record set straight, not primarily because the record matters, but because being misunderstood feels like a kind of injury. Most of us give in to this urge, and most of the time it costs us nothing, because nobody was paying much attention in the first place. Now consider a person whose response would be reported. For them, the arithmetic inverts. Responding to a criticism does not neutralize the criticism, it amplifies it. It informs a much larger audience that the criticism exists. It confirms that the criticism landed, and it hands the critic a status upgrade by treating them as a peer worth answering. The clearest illustration of this dynamic has a name. In 2003, the singer Barbra Streisand attempted to have an aerial photograph of her clifftop property removed from a publicly available coastal erosion archive, filing a lawsuit over privacy concerns. Before the legal action, the photograph had been downloaded a handful of times, and 2 of those downloads were reportedly by her own lawyers. After the lawsuit became public, it was viewed hundreds of thousands of times. The attempt to suppress the information became the reason the information spread. The pattern was named the Streisand effect, and it has since described countless attempts by wealthy and powerful people to control a narrative through direct confrontation, only to enlarge it, which teaches a lesson that experienced public figures internalize fairly quickly. Attention is a currency, and responding to an attack is a payment. You are transferring your audience to your critic. In many cases, the most effective response available is the one that costs nothing and gives nothing. There is a phrase for this that circulates in strategic circles, and it captures something real. Refusing to respond is refusing to enter someone else's frame. The critic has constructed a scenario in which certain questions are the important ones, certain accusations are the relevant ones, and you are the defendant. Answering accepts all of those premises before you have said a word. Silence declines the whole architecture. This is genuinely powerful, and it is also genuinely dangerous, and we will return to the danger later. Because a person who never answers criticism is a person who has made themselves unaccountable, and there is a very short distance between not dignifying nonsense with a response and simply refusing to be questioned by anyone about anything. Beneath all of this sits a broader pattern that social psychologists have studied for decades, concerning the relationship between status and the way people talk. Watch any group of people meeting for the first time in a professional setting, and you can often locate the hierarchy within 10 minutes, purely from conversational behavior. Certain people work visibly hard. They mention credentials. They reference impressive names. They explain their reasoning at length. They laugh slightly too early at the senior person's jokes. They fill every silence, because silence feels like a vacuum into which their status might disappear. Other people do almost none of this. They speak briefly. They ask questions rather than making declarations. They do not appear to need the room's agreement. The research here is more nuanced than the folk version. Cameron Anderson at Berkeley and colleagues have spent years studying how status is actually conferred in groups, and one consistent finding is that groups grant status to people they perceive as contributing to the group's goals, and withdraw it from people who appear to be pursuing status for its own sake. Visible striving for status frequently reduces status. which produces an uncomfortable trap for anyone who wants it badly, because wanting it visibly is precisely the behavior that prevents it. There is also work suggesting that a sense of power changes cognition itself. Adam Galinsky and colleagues published a striking series of experiments in 2006 in which participants were primed to feel powerful and then asked to draw the letter E on their own forehead. Those in the high-power condition were significantly more likely to draw it oriented for themselves rather than for an observer, which the researchers interpreted as reduced spontaneous perspective-taking. Later work by Sukhwinder Obhi and colleagues, published in 2014, found that priming power appeared to dampen activity in the brain's motor resonance system, the mechanism involved in unconsciously mirroring other people. But I want to be careful here, and this is one of the places where honesty matters more than a satisfying narrative. Priming studies of this kind have faced serious replication difficulties across social psychology over the past decade. Some of these specific findings have held up better than others. The general direction, that power tends to reduce attentiveness to other people, is supported by a fairly wide range of evidence, including field observations and behavioral studies. The precise mechanisms are considerably less settled than popular accounts suggest. So let us take the modest version, which is well supported. High-status individuals face less pressure to signal, and therefore signal less. Low-status individuals face more pressure to prove themselves, and therefore prove themselves more visibly. And let us immediately complicate it, because the simple version becomes actively misleading if left alone. Quietness does not equal confidence. Some quiet people in rooms are the most powerful person present. Others are terrified, or bored, or unwell, or thinking about something entirely unrelated, or simply come from a culture where interrupting a senior colleague is unthinkable. Meanwhile, some extremely loud people are not insecure in the slightest. They are enthusiastic, or they are the kind of thinker who works out what they believe by saying it aloud, or they have correctly calculated that in their particular industry, visibility is the entire game. Anyone who reads a room purely by volume is going to be wrong constantly, and will be easy to deceive by anyone who has learned to perform stillness. Which brings us to a distinction that runs through the whole history of elite culture, and it is one of the most useful ideas in this entire subject. Secrecy and discretion are not the same thing. Secrecy is concealment with intent. Something exists that would change how people judge you, and you are working to keep it from them. Secrecy has an object. It is about a specific thing. Discretion is something else entirely. Discretion is a general orientation, a background assumption that not everything requires an audience. The discreet person is not hiding anything in particular. They simply do not consider the world entitled to a running commentary on their affairs. You can see the difference in how each behaves under pressure. Secrecy becomes anxious when questioned, because there is something specific to protect. Discretion is largely unbothered, because there is no particular fact whose exposure would be catastrophic. There is only a preference for a quieter life. Entire institutions have been built on the second of these, and some of them are extremely old. Private banking in Switzerland formalized confidentiality in a banking law passed in 1934, though the culture of discretion in Geneva and Zurich long predated the legislation and had roots stretching back to the 18th century. The family office as an institution is usually traced to the Rockefeller family's establishment of a dedicated office to manage their affairs in the late 19th century, though the underlying practice of employing stewards for great fortunes is far older than that. The private members' clubs of St. James's in London operated for generations on an unwritten understanding that what was discussed inside was not repeated outside, an understanding enforced not by law, but by the far more effective mechanism of permanent social exclusion for anyone who broke it. What all of these share is a recognition that information behaves differently depending on how many people hold it. A piece of knowledge held by 4 people is an advantage. The same piece of knowledge held by 4,000 is merely news. Value in information is inseparable from its scarcity, which means that any circle wishing to preserve the value of what it knows must limit the circle. This has an ugly side, obviously. Closed circles concentrate opportunity among people who already have it. Discretion among elites has historically been indistinguishable from the outside, from collusion. And sometimes it genuinely was collusion. A tradition of not asking difficult questions about a colleague's affairs has protected a great deal of wisdom and a great deal of criminality, and it does not always announce which is which. But the underlying informational logic is worth understanding on its own terms, because it explains something fundamental about why the wealthy behave as they do. Economists have a precise name for it: information asymmetry. Set two people at a table. Both want to reach an agreement. The first knows exactly what they want. The second knows exactly what they want and, crucially, also knows exactly what the first person wants, along with their deadline, their alternatives, their financial position, and the fact that their board is losing patience. The second person is not cleverer, they are not more articulate, they will probably speak less, and they will almost certainly do better, because the negotiation is no longer between two people with equal maps. One of them can see the whole board. The formal study of this began with an economist named George Akerlof, whose 1970 paper on the market for used cars demonstrated that when sellers know more about quality than buyers, markets can degrade badly, with good products driven out because buyers cannot distinguish them and will not pay for what they cannot verify. Akerlof shared the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2001 with Michael Spence and Joseph Stiglitz for work on markets with asymmetric information. Spence's contribution concerned signaling, the ways in which the better-informed party can credibly communicate what they know. Stiglitz's concerned screening, the ways in which the less-informed party can extract it. The entire modern apparatus of professional investment can be understood as an industrial-scale attempt to sit on the favorable side of that asymmetry. Vast sums are spent gathering information. Analysts, researchers, satellite imagery of car parks, shipping data, credit card aggregates, expert networks, private conversations with suppliers and former executives. Enormous effort flows inward, and comparatively little flows out. Positions are disclosed only when regulation requires it, and frequently with a delay. Intentions are not announced. Interest in an acquisition is concealed for as long as possible, because the moment interest becomes known, the price moves against you, which reframes the silence we have been discussing. For an ordinary person, saying less is a personality trait. For a large investor, saying less is a fiduciary obligation. Talking is not merely unwise. It is a transfer of value from the people whose money you manage to the people you are talking to. And a person who spends 30 years inside that discipline does not switch it off at dinner. There is one further advantage to being the quiet one in a room, and it has nothing to do with concealment. It has to do with what becomes available to a person who is not busy talking. Speech consumes attention. This is not a metaphor. Producing coherent language in real time draws on working memory, planning, monitoring, and social calibration simultaneously. Anyone who has tried to hold a serious thought while also delivering a presentation knows the sensation of the thought slipping away, because the machinery required to speak is largely the same machinery required to think carefully. The person who is silent has all of that capacity available for something else. They can watch. And what becomes visible when you watch a room properly is remarkable. Who interrupts whom, and who never interrupts anyone? Who checks a particular person's face after making a joke? Who has stopped listening and is waiting for their turn? Who becomes noticeably more animated when a particular subject arises? And who becomes noticeably careful? Who defers? Who is deferred to, which is not always the same person as the one with the senior title? Who arrived already knowing what would be decided? Who is discovering it in the room? Who is angry and concealing it? Who is frightened? Who wants something from somebody here and has not yet found a way to ask? None of this appears in the minutes. All of it is information. The talker leaves the room having transmitted. The observer leaves having received. Over years, across thousands of rooms, that difference compounds into something that looks like extraordinary intuition and is largely just accumulated attention. If you want to see this temperament in its most documented form, it is worth spending a little time in Omaha, Nebraska. Warren Buffett is an odd choice of case study for a documentary about silence, and it is important to be honest about that. He is one of the most talkative billionaires who has ever lived. He has written a shareholder letter every year for more than half a century. He hosts an annual meeting attended by tens of thousands of people, where he answers questions for hours. He has given a great many interviews. He is quotable to the point of being overquoted. So the silence in question is not conversational. It is operational. The distinctive thing about Buffett's approach has always been the extraordinary quantity of things he does not do. He has described investing using an analogy drawn from baseball, borrowed from the batter Ted Williams, who divided the strike zone into cells and knew his batting average in each one. The point of the analogy is that in investing, unlike in baseball, there are no called strikes. Nobody forces you to swing. You can stand there and let 1,000 pitches go past and wait for the one in exactly the right place. He has also offered a thought experiment about a punch card with 20 slots, representing every investment decision a person is permitted to make in an entire lifetime. Under those constraints, the argument goes, a person would think enormously carefully before each one and would probably end up considerably wealthier than someone making 20 decisions a year. Both of these ideas point in the same direction, and it runs directly against the instincts of almost every ambitious person. Inactivity is a decision. Sitting still is a position. The refusal to act is not the absence of a strategy. It is frequently the strategy. This is psychologically much harder than it sounds, and the reason it is hard has been studied. There is a well-documented tendency, sometimes described in the literature as action bias, for people to prefer doing something over doing nothing, particularly when they feel responsible for an outcome and are being watched. One frequently cited demonstration involved football goalkeepers facing penalty kicks. The economist Michael Bar-Eli and colleagues published an analysis in 2007 of hundreds of penalties in top competitions and found that goalkeepers dived left or right in the overwhelming majority of cases, while the statistically optimal choice, given the distribution of kicks, was more often to stay in the center. The likely explanation offered was that a goalkeeper who dives and fails has visibly tried. A goalkeeper who stands still and concedes appears to have done nothing. Anyone who has worked inside an organization will recognize this immediately. Doing nothing looks like negligence. Doing something looks like leadership, even when the something is wrong, which means that a person capable of sitting motionless through a period when everyone around them is acting must be able to tolerate looking foolish, sometimes for years. Buffett's business partner for more than 4 decades was Charlie Munger, who died in November 2023 at the age of 99, and whose temperament was in some ways an even purer expression of the same idea. Munger was not a quiet man in conversation. He was famously blunt, frequently to the point of rudeness, and had no discernible interest in softening his assessments to make people comfortable. But his approach to decisions was built almost entirely around the discipline of doing nothing until something genuinely worthwhile appeared. He spoke often about how much of the return in a long investing life comes not from clever buying and selling, but from the waiting in between. He described sorting opportunities into 3 piles, one for yes, one for no, and a large one for anything too difficult to understand, which he was entirely comfortable leaving unexamined. What is striking about that third pile is how directly it contradicts the culture most of us live inside. We are trained to have opinions on everything, immediately and publicly. The admission that a subject is simply too hard and that one intends to have no view on it at all is almost socially unacceptable now. It reads as evasion. Munger treated it as a competitive advantage, and the logic is difficult to argue with. Most of the damage done to a portfolio, a career, or a life comes not from the opportunities missed, but from the actions taken without sufficient understanding. But it is worth resisting the temptation to convert all of this into a general philosophy of patience for everyone. This kind of extended waiting requires conditions that most people do not have. It requires capital that does not need to be deployed. It requires investors who will not withdraw during a fallow decade. It requires a reputation established well enough that inactivity is read as discipline rather than incompetence. A young fund manager who sits in cash for 4 years is not admired for their temperament. They are unemployed. Patience, once again, is partly a psychological trait and partly a luxury good. And around fortunes of that scale, an entire structure grows, which produces a form of silence that has nothing to do with temperament at all. Picture the machinery surrounding a large modern fortune, and notice how much of it is essentially a filtration system. There is a family office which may employ dozens of people managing investments, property, tax, philanthropy, travel, and the affairs of 3 generations. There are lawyers, plural, in several jurisdictions. There are accountants who understand structures that took years to build. There are investment managers who make hundreds of decisions the principal never hears about. There are security consultants who assess routes and venues and background check the people who serve dinner. There is a communications advisor whose entire professional function is to prevent unconsidered sentences from reaching the public. There is a board with legal duties and disclosure obligations. There are trusts, foundations, and holding companies, some created for tax efficiency, some for succession, some for privacy, most for all 3. Now consider what it is like to be at the center of that. A journalist's question does not reach you. It reaches a communications team who consider it, discuss it, draft something, and possibly decline. A charitable request does not reach you. It reaches a foundation with an application process. An investment proposal does not reach you. It reaches an associate who reads 100 a week. A dispute does not reach you. It reaches counsel. The person at the center may be perfectly willing to speak. There is simply nowhere for unmediated speech to occur anymore, and no unmediated question ever arrives to prompt it. This is why some of the silence around extreme wealth is not psychological, but structural. It is not that a particular individual has cultivated an air of mystery. It is that the institutional apparatus surrounding them absorbs communication in both directions, and what emerges at the other end is processed, considered, delayed, and stripped of anything spontaneous. Which sounds enviable, and in some respects is. It is also, if you think about it for a moment, a slow form of sensory deprivation. There is a related question here about plans, and about why people at every level of success tend to become more protective of what they intend to do as the intention becomes more serious. Part of the answer is psychological, and it needs handling with some care, because the popular version has outrun the evidence. The psychologist Peter Gollwitzer and colleagues published a set of studies in 2009 examining what happens when people announce their goals to others. Across several experiments with students pursuing identity-relevant goals, those who told someone about their intention subsequently spent less time working towards it, while reporting a greater sense of being close to achieving it. The proposed explanation was that the social recognition of the intention provided a premature sense of completeness, a phenomenon the researchers connected to older work on substitution in goal pursuit. This finding has been enormously popular, and it has also been contested. Later work has produced mixed results, with some studies failing to find the effect, and others suggesting that the consequences of disclosure depend heavily on who you tell, why you tell them, and whether they are in a position to hold you accountable. Telling a supportive friend who will ask how it went is not the same as announcing an ambition to an audience whose applause is itself the reward. So the honest summary is this: there is real experimental evidence that announcing goals can sometimes reduce the drive to complete them. The mechanism is plausible, and it is not a settled law of human nature. The practical reasons for discretion, on the other hand, are not contested at all, because they are simply logistics. A plan that has not been announced cannot be publicly judged, which means it can be abandoned without embarrassment when better information arrives. An acquisition that remains unknown cannot be disrupted by a competing bidder or a sudden increase in price. A negotiating position that has not been declared cannot be anticipated and countered. A personal decision that has not been shared cannot be endlessly relitigated by everyone who has an opinion about it and no responsibility for the outcome. Every announcement converts a private, flexible intention into a public, rigid commitment. Sometimes that conversion is exactly what you want, because commitment produces discipline. Often it is simply the surrender of maneuvering room for a moment of social approval. Related to all this is the matter of permanence. Reputation compounds in a way that is genuinely similar to capital. It accumulates slowly, it can be reinvested, and it can be destroyed considerably faster than it was built. The great asymmetry is that the accumulation takes decades of consistent behavior, while the destruction can take one sentence. And now that sentence is permanent. This is genuinely new in human history, and we have not adapted to it. For most of the past, an ill-judged remark decayed. It was repeated a few times, distorted, and forgotten. There was no artifact. Now every remark is a file. It can be retrieved in 15 years by someone with a motive, presented without the context that made it comprehensible, and used as evidence of character. For a person whose reputation is attached to a company employing thousands of people, to investors, to a family name, to charitable institutions, the calculation becomes stark. The upside of a spontaneous public remark is small. The downside is unbounded, so communication slows down, sentences get drafted, interviews get prepared for. The natural human rhythm of saying what occurs to you is replaced by something more like publishing. It costs something, that transformation. What it costs is the possibility of being fully known by anyone outside a very small group, which brings us to the size of that group and to one of the loneliest patterns in this entire subject. The anthropologist Robin Dunbar proposed in the early 1990s that there is a rough upper limit to the number of stable social relationships a human being can maintain, based on a correlation between the size of the neocortex and typical group size across primate species. The number most commonly cited from his work is around 150. He also described a layered structure within that, with an innermost circle of perhaps 3 to 5 people of genuine intimacy, a further layer of around 15 close friends, a layer of around 50, and so outward. It should be said that the number has been challenged. A study led by Patrick Lindenfors and colleagues, published in 2021, argued that the statistical basis for a precise figure is much weaker than commonly assumed, and that the confidence intervals around any such estimate are enormous. Dunbar has defended the underlying work. What survives the argument is not a magic number, but a fairly uncontroversial observation. Human capacity for close relationships is limited, and it is limited by something other than opportunity, which explains something that otherwise looks like ingratitude. A person of great wealth and influence may know, in some functional sense, thousands of people. Their contact list is extraordinary. They can reach almost anyone. And yet the innermost circle remains the same size as everybody else's, because that constraint is not financial. Worse, the selection problem inside that circle becomes far harder. Most people build intimacy through unremarkable accumulated proximity: school, work, neighbors, a shared decade. The relationships form before anyone has anything worth taking. But a person who becomes enormously wealthy at 40 must evaluate every subsequent relationship under conditions of permanent ambiguity, and many of them retreat, understandably, to the friendships formed before the money existed. Which is why you so often find billionaires whose closest friends are people they met at 19, when nobody was anybody. And when those relationships are unavailable or have not survived, something quite bleak can occur. A person surrounded by hundreds of people, all of whom are attentive, all of whom are pleasant, none of whom would tell them anything difficult, which is exactly the point at which we should stop admiring any of this. Because everything described so far has a shadow, and the shadow is proportionate to the thing casting it. Silence can be strategy. Silence can also be avoidance wearing a very good suit. The person who never explains themselves may be exercising admirable restraint. They may also simply be unwilling to be questioned by anyone about anything, which is a different condition entirely, and is frequently mistaken for the first. The person who never reacts may have achieved genuine equanimity. They may also be emotionally absent in a way that is devastating to live with. Ask the families. The composure that reads as gravitas in a boardroom can read as coldness at a kitchen table, and the same man described by colleagues as impressively self-contained is sometimes described by his children as someone who was never quite there. The person with the small, tightly controlled inner circle may have chosen wisely. They may also have constructed a world containing nobody with the standing to contradict them. That last risk is the serious one, and it is well documented under several names. There is a phenomenon identified by Sidney Rosen and Abraham Tesser in 1970 that they called the mum effect, describing a reluctance to transmit unpleasant information. Across their experiments, people were markedly less willing to pass on bad news than good, even when the news was unrelated to them personally and there was no obvious cost to delivering it. Subsequent research has found the effect strengthens when the recipient has power over the messenger. Consider what that means at the top of an organization. The information traveling upward is systematically filtered for pleasantness, not by conspiracy, but by 1,000 individual acts of ordinary human self-protection. Nobody lies. Things are simply softened, delayed, reframed, and left for a better moment that never quite arrives. Amy Edmondson at Harvard Business School has spent a career on the related question of psychological safety, the shared belief within a team that speaking up will not be punished. Her research, beginning with a famously counterintuitive finding in hospital teams where better performing units appeared to report more errors because they were willing to discuss them, has consistently shown that silence in organizations is very often a symptom rather than a strength. People stay quiet because they have calculated, usually correctly, that candor is expensive. Now combine these: a person of enormous wealth, a structure that filters incoming information, a staff whose livelihoods depend on the relationship, a social circle selected for loyalty, a temperament that does not explain itself and does not react, and a public which, if it criticizes, is simply not answered. That person may be extraordinarily wise. They will also be extremely difficult to correct. Silence protects wisdom. It protects delusion equally well, and it does not distinguish between them. The insulation goes further than information, and this may be the most underrated aspect of the entire phenomenon. Ordinary life is full of friction, queues, delays, broken things, bureaucracy, strangers who are rude for no reason, trains that do not arrive, forms that must be filled in twice, prices that must be considered before purchasing. Most of this friction is unpleasant, and almost all of it is informative. It is how we learn what things cost, how systems actually function for the people inside them, and what other people's lives are like. Enormous wealth removes friction with tremendous efficiency. That is very close to what it is for. The queue is bypassed. The delay is absorbed by someone else. The broken thing is replaced before it is noticed. The bureaucracy is handled by a firm. The rude stranger never gets close. The train is irrelevant. The form is completed by an assistant. The price is not checked, because checking has become pointless. And so, without any decision being made, a person can end up living in a world with almost no resistance in it at all. Every surface smooth, every interaction managed, every problem solved slightly before it appeared, by someone whose name they may not know. Ask what that does to perception over 20 years. It is not that such a person becomes stupid. Frequently, they remain formidably intelligent about the things they engage with. But the sample of reality available to them narrows dramatically, and it narrows in a specific direction, filtering out precisely the experiences that generate ordinary calibration. There is a reason wealthy public figures so regularly misjudge the cost of everyday goods, or the difficulty of ordinary administrative processes, or the amount of slack in an ordinary household budget. They are not lying. They genuinely do not know, and nothing in their environment has corrected them, which suggests a rather deflating reinterpretation of the quiet at the center of great wealth. Some of it is discipline, some of it is strategy, and some of it is simply that the world around them has become quiet, because everything that might have made noise has been handled by somebody else. There is a cultural dimension to all of this, older than any of the psychology, and it is worth walking through slowly. Consider a house in the English countryside, not a famous one, a long gravel drive with no gates and no sign, an unremarkable entrance, a family who have owned the land for 200 years and whose name means nothing at all to anyone outside the county. The carpets are worn, the car in the yard is 15 years old and covered in mud. The paintings on the wall are of ancestors nobody photographs. Now consider a penthouse in a new tower in a new city. Everything visible, everything recent, everything unmistakably expensive at a glance. The temptation is to construct a moral hierarchy out of these two images, and it is a temptation worth resisting, because the moral hierarchy is precisely what the first image was designed to produce. Established wealth in Britain and continental Europe did develop powerful cultural norms around understatement, restraint in display, discomfort with explicit discussion of money, a preference for objects that reveal their quality only to people already educated to recognize it. The general principle that anything requiring announcement was thereby diminished. Thorstein Veblen described the mechanism from the outside in his 1899 study of the leisure class, coining the phrase conspicuous consumption for spending, whose purpose is the display of capacity to spend. What Veblen also noticed, and what is quoted far less often, is that as a display becomes accessible to more people, its value as a signal collapses, and the group above must find a new one. That is the engine driving the whole system, and it never stops running. When only the wealthy could afford a large house signaled wealth. When mortgages spread, something else was required. When only the wealthy could travel signaled wealth. When flights became cheap, it did not. When only the wealthy could be fat, fatness signaled prosperity. When calories became abundant, thinness took its place. Pierre Bourdieu extended this considerably in his 1979 work on taste and social distinction, arguing that aesthetic preferences are not innocent expressions of individual sensibility, but function as markers of class position, acquired through upbringing and education, and effective precisely because they appear natural to those who possess them, and unattainable to those who do not. Which is the more honest reading of the quiet country house? The understatement is not the absence of a status display. It is a status display that requires an expensive education to read, and which therefore cannot be purchased by anyone who has recently acquired money and does not know the codes. The economist and sociologist Elizabeth Currid Halkett gave the contemporary version a name in her 2017 book on the subject, describing inconspicuous consumption, the shift of elite spending away from visible goods and towards things that do not photograph. Education, healthcare, domestic help, time, services that raise a family's position without appearing on anybody's feed. And this is what modern quiet luxury actually is, once the marketing has been stripped away. A jumper costing more than most people's monthly rent, with nothing on it. A coat whose cut is recognizable to perhaps 200 people in a city. A watch that reads as ordinary from more than a meter away. A car chosen for the quality of its silence rather than the noise of its engine. A restaurant whose entrance looks like a service door. A hotel where the check-in happens in a room, in an armchair, with no counter at all. The appeal is genuine on its own terms, because these things are frequently very well made and very pleasant to use. But the status function is unmistakable, and it operates through a specific mechanism. The signal is designed to be invisible to most observers and instantly legible to a few, which means the wearer is not communicating with the general public at all. They are communicating with a small number of people who share their reference set, while remaining unreadable to everybody else. That is the same structure as the silence we have been examining, expressed in cloth. Restricted transmission, selective legibility, value preserved through scarcity of recognition. It also raises a question worth pausing on, because it cuts to the center of everything. If millions of people are looking at you, do you have power or do you merely have attention? These are not the same thing, and confusing them is one of the defining errors of the present era. Certain forms of power are entirely dependent on visibility. A performer without an audience has no career. An influencer without attention has no income. A politician who cannot be seen cannot be elected. For these people, obscurity is not privacy, it is extinction, and their apparent openness is not generosity of spirit, but a professional requirement. Other forms of power function perfectly well, sometimes better, unobserved. The person who controls the capital allocation of a large institution may be unknown outside their industry, while making decisions that affect tens of thousands of livelihoods. The lawyer who structures the arrangement is not famous. The family that owns significant portions of a city through a chain of holding companies may have no public presence of any kind. There are individuals with more real influence over what gets built, funded, hired and closed than almost any household name, and you would not recognize them in a queue at an airport. Herbert Simon made the essential observation as early as 1971, noting that in a world of abundant information, the scarce resource becomes the attention required to consume it. What he saw, decades before it became obvious, was that attention would become the thing markets fought over. And here is the uncomfortable consequence. Anything that becomes a market can be bought, sold, manufactured, and inflated. Attention can be purchased. Fame can be manufactured. Visibility can be engineered by people with no underlying capability whatsoever. Whereas the ability to determine outcomes cannot be bought quite so easily, and it leaves fewer traces. So a reasonable question to carry through the rest of the night is this. When you look at a person and feel that they are important, are you responding to their power or simply to the volume of attention pointed at them? Because those two things have separated almost completely, and most of us have not updated our instincts accordingly. There is a deeper reason for staying quiet than any of the ones we have covered, and it may be the most elegant idea in the whole subject. Speaking commits you. Silence preserves possibility. Once you have publicly declared what you believe, what you want, what you intend to do, Several things happen simultaneously, and none of them can be undone. Other people can organize around the information. Opponents can prepare. Prices can adjust. Allies can form expectations you may later be unable to meet. And you yourself become subject to one of the most powerful forces in social psychology, the pressure towards consistency with your own previous statements, which Robert Cialdini identified as a fundamental principle of influence and which operates on all of us far more strongly than we like to believe. Having said a thing aloud, you are now somebody who said it. Changing your mind is no longer a private update. It is a public reversal, and it will be described as one. Remaining quiet preserves the freedom to become someone else next month. In finance, there is a precise word for the value of a preserved possibility: optionality. An option is the right to do something without the obligation to do it, and options have positive value even when unexercised, because the world may move in your favor and you will be positioned to respond. Uncertainty, counterintuitively, increases the value of an option rather than decreasing it, because a wider range of possible futures means more chance that one of them is extremely good. Silence is a psychological option. You retain the right to act without having promised to act. You retain the ability to change direction without owing anyone an explanation for the change. You keep several futures open at once, and you allow the world to reveal a little more before you commit. The cost is real and should be acknowledged. Optionality is not free. A person who commits to nothing may drift, endlessly preserving possibilities without ever choosing any of them, which is not strategy but avoidance. Public commitment produces discipline. It recruits other people to your cause. It builds the kind of reputation that only comes from having said you would do something difficult and then done it. So the skill is not permanent silence. It is knowing which of your intentions genuinely benefit from being witnessed, and which are simply being spent on the small pleasure of being interesting at dinner. Let us sit inside a room for a moment, because this is easier to feel than to explain. A private dining room somewhere in a city, up a staircase, behind a door with no name on it. Paneled walls, low light, 8 people around a table that seats 12, so there is space between them. A fire that is decorative rather than necessary. The sound of the street entirely absent. 7 of these people are working, whether or not they would describe it that way. One is telling a story that has been told before and has been improved in the retelling. One is waiting for a gap in order to mention, casually, a name that will reposition them slightly. One is agreeing enthusiastically with whoever spoke last. One is explaining their reasoning about something nobody questioned. One is checking, after each of their own contributions, whether it landed. One is laughing a fraction early. One is describing a difficulty in a way designed to demonstrate the scale of their responsibilities. The 8th person has said almost nothing. They arrived without ceremony. They have listened to each speaker with what appears to be genuine interest. Twice they have asked a question, and both questions were specific enough that the person answering had to think properly before replying. They have mentioned nothing about themselves. They have made no claims, offered no credentials, corrected nobody, and agreed with nothing in particular. And somewhere around the 2nd hour, without anyone deciding it, the direction of the table changes. People begin speaking towards them. Statements are made, and then glanced at their face for a reaction. When they finally offer a short observation, the room becomes noticeably quieter to receive it. Why does this happen? It is worth being precise, because the romantic explanation is wrong. It is not that silence contains magic. It is that the 8th person has demonstrated, through behavior rather than assertion, that they need nothing from the room. Everyone else has revealed a want. The stories, the names, the agreements, the early laughter, all of it is a request for something. And every request lowers the requester's position slightly, because it establishes who is seeking and who is being sought. Perceived independence generates status. The person who appears least in need of approval tends to receive the most, which is one of the crueler ironies in human social life, since it means the thing cannot be obtained by pursuing it. And now the honest caveat, because there is a version of this scene that is entirely hollow. The eighth person may be extraordinary, or they may be an ordinary person who has learned that saying little creates an impression of depth, and who has nothing behind it at all. This is where projection enters, and projection is the most misunderstood force in the whole of this subject. When a person reveals very little, the human mind does not tolerate the gap. It fills it, and what it fills the gap with is not neutral, and it is not accurate. It is constructed from expectation, from context, from what we already believe about people who occupy that kind of chair. If we already believe the quiet person is important, we fill the silence with wisdom, calculation, and hidden depth. If we already believe they are hostile, we fill the same silence with contempt and judgment. The silence itself contains no content whatsoever. It is a surface onto which the observer paints, and the observer paints from their own supply. There is relevant experimental work here. Michael Norton, Gina Frost, and Dan Ariely published a series of studies in 2007 with a finding they summarized as less being more. Contrary to the intuition that learning about someone increases liking, they found that in several contexts, acquiring more information about another person actually reduced how much participants liked them, because ambiguity had allowed the observer to assume similarity, and each new detail was another chance to discover a difference. Which means the quiet person is often benefiting from something they have not earned. Ambiguity is inflating them. The mystery is doing work that their actual qualities might not survive. This should make us all a little more careful in both directions. Careful about the impressive silent figure in the room, who may be exactly what they appear to be, and may be a blank wall we have decorated ourselves. And careful about the temptation to cultivate that effect deliberately, because a reputation built on ambiguity has a specific failure mode. It cannot survive contact. Sooner or later, a situation arrives that requires you to actually know something, and the accumulated projection collapses in a single afternoon. Silence can make a person appear more impressive than they are. It cannot make them more impressive than they are. Underneath all of these grand structures, however, sits something extremely small, and it is available to everyone listening tonight without any wealth, status, or strategy whatsoever. The pause. 3 seconds. That is all it is. Somebody asks you a question, something difficult, or unexpected, or slightly provocative, and instead of answering into the space immediately, you let 3 seconds pass. Recall the research from earlier. Ordinary conversational turn-taking runs on gaps of roughly 0.2 of a second. 3 full seconds is therefore approximately 15 times the expected interval, which is why it feels enormous from the inside. Your nervous system will inform you, quite insistently, that something has gone wrong, that the room is waiting, that you are failing. From the outside, almost nothing is happening. A brief consideration, a person taking a question seriously, but something significant has occurred inside that gap. Most people begin speaking before they have finished thinking, because the social discomfort of the pause outweighs the cognitive benefit of the thought. The answer that emerges is therefore not the best answer available. It is the fastest acceptable one, assembled under pressure, and often it is a defense rather than a thought. The 3-second pause simply purchases the difference between those two things. It also communicates something without a word being spoken. A person who answers instantly appears to be reacting. A person who considers, briefly, appears to be deciding. The content might be identical, the impression is not. And there is a further, quieter benefit, which has nothing to do with impressions. In that gap, you get to notice what you were about to say. Most of the sentences we later regret were formed in the 0.2 of a second before we spoke them, and would not have survived 3 seconds of examination. Alongside the pause sits its natural partner, and this one may be the most practically valuable idea in the entire documentary. Listening is not a passive activity, and it is not primarily a virtue. It is an extraordinarily efficient method of acquiring information about the world. People want to be listened to with an intensity that is difficult to overstate. Genuine attention is rarer than almost any material commodity, and someone offering it will be given things in return, freely, without being asked. Within an hour of real listening, a person will typically tell you what they are afraid of, what they want that they have not admitted wanting, who they resent, what they are protecting, what they would do differently, where the pressure in their life is coming from, and what would have to be true for them to say yes to something. None of this is extracted. It is offered, gratefully, because so few people ever ask a second question. Meanwhile, the listener has revealed almost nothing. This is where the ethics matter more than anywhere else in this subject, and it needs saying plainly. There is a version of this that is predatory. Listening in order to harvest, asking questions in order to locate the point of maximum leverage, cultivating trust for the purpose of exploiting it. That behavior exists, it is effective in the short term, and it is one of the ugliest things a person can do with a genuine skill. There is another version, which is simply paying attention because other people are interesting, and because understanding what someone actually wants is the only reliable route to arrangements that hold. That version accumulates exactly the same information. It arrives at similar advantages, and it does not leave a trail of people who feel they were mined. The information is identical. What differs is what you intend to do with it, and that intention will become visible eventually, because it always does. There is one more mechanism to understand before we begin to slow down, and it explains a great deal of behavior that gets misread as coldness. Money changes the cost of saying yes. For most people, most of the time, agreeing to something is cheap. A favor costs an afternoon. An introduction costs an email. Attending an event costs an evening. The requests arrive at a manageable rate, and the resources they consume are ordinary. Now increase the wealth, and watch what happens to that arithmetic. The requests do not merely become larger, they become continuous, and they become precedents. Agreeing to invest in one friend's company establishes that you invest in friends' companies, and there are more friends. Attending one charitable gala establishes that you attend, and there are 400 charities. Making one introduction establishes that your network is available, and networks are not infinitely renewable, because every introduction you make spends a small amount of credibility with the person receiving it. Answering one message quickly establishes that you answer quickly, and the volume adjusts to fill the response rate. Each yes is therefore not a single act of generosity. It is a policy, and it will be treated as one, which produces a behavior that looks unkind from the outside and is frequently the opposite. The refusal to give a quick answer, the delay, the referral to a foundation, an office, a process, the vagueness that feels evasive. What is actually happening, in many cases, is that the person has learned that an immediate yes is not sustainable, and an immediate no is unnecessarily brutal, and so they have developed a third response, which is simply to take the question away from the moment, not to decide in the room, not to decide under the gaze of someone hoping, and the capacity to do that, to hold a question without resolving it while someone is watching you and wanting an answer, requires precisely the tolerance for silence we have been describing all evening. Which brings us, gently, to something more personal and considerably closer to your own life than boardrooms and family offices. Sometimes silence is not strategy at all. Sometimes it is simply a boundary. Not every message requires a reply. Not every invitation requires attendance. Not every opinion about you requires correction. Not every disagreement deserves a debate. Not every person who wants access to your thoughts is entitled to it. This is not manipulation. It is the ordinary business of having a finite life and deciding what to spend it on. But there is a distinction here that matters more than almost anything else in this documentary, and it should be stated clearly before the night gets any quieter. Healthy boundaries and the silent treatment are not the same thing, and they are not even related. A boundary is a limit you place on your own participation. It is about what you will do. It is generally communicable, and it does not require the other person to suffer in order to work. You can say that you are not discussing this subject, and mean it, and remain warm. The silent treatment is something else. It is withdrawal deployed as a punishment, designed to produce distress in another person until they modify their behavior. It requires them to feel the absence. That is the entire mechanism, and it does considerable damage. The psychologist Kipling Williams has spent decades studying ostracism, including through a simple experimental paradigm involving a virtual ball-tossing game in which participants are gradually excluded by other players. The finding, replicated many times, is that even trivial and obviously meaningless exclusion produces measurable distress, lowering people's sense of belonging, self-esteem, control, and meaningful existence. In some studies, participants reported distress even when they knew the other players were computers, which tells us that being deliberately unheard is not a mild social inconvenience. It is registered by the human mind as something closer to injury. So the same behavior, viewed from outside, can be two entirely different things. One person declines to argue because the argument is unwinnable and unnecessary, and they remain perfectly available in every other respect. Another person withdraws in order to make somebody hurt. Only one of those is composure. The other is control wearing composure's clothing, and the difference is not visible from the outside. It is only visible in what the silence is for. Now let us bring all of this somewhere useful, because almost none of us are going to become billionaires, and that was never the point of the evening. The lesson here is not to act mysterious so that people assume you are powerful. That approach produces a hollow person who is eventually found out, and it mistakes the shadow for the object. The genuinely useful version is quieter and more ordinary. Speak a little more deliberately, not because words are dangerous, but because they are worth something, and most of us give them away for nothing. Listen properly, at least once a day, to somebody who is not expecting it. Notice how much of what you say is a request for reassurance, and let some of those requests go unmade, and observe what happens. Keep certain plans to yourself while they are still fragile, not out of secrecy, but because a plan that has not been discussed cannot be talked out of you by somebody who is frightened on your behalf. Learn the difference between feeling something and being governed by it, which is perhaps the single most valuable psychological skill available to a human being and takes many years to acquire. Stop explaining yourself to people who have already decided what you are. That conversation has no end and no winner, and your energy is finite. Get comfortable with pauses. 3 seconds. Let the room hold it. Nothing will break. Choose your inner circle carefully, and understand that it will be small whatever you do, and that this is not a failure, but a property of being human. And let your actions carry some of the weight that your words are currently carrying alone. None of that requires money. Most of it is simply the practice of being slightly less available for other people's frames, and slightly more present inside your own. Which brings us, at last, to the paradox underneath all of it. When we are young, we tend to believe that being noticed is the same as mattering. We want to be heard. We want to be understood. We want to be recognized, admired, agreed with. We want the last word in the argument, and we want it to be devastating. We want the people who were wrong about us to know that they were wrong, in detail, with sources. There is nothing shameful in this. It is close to universal, and it comes from something perfectly reasonable, which is the desire to be real to other people. But something shifts, for most of us, somewhere in the middle of a life. You begin to notice that you won an argument 3 years ago and cannot recall the topic. You notice that the person you needed to convince has forgotten the entire episode. You notice that the plans you announced with great confidence were quietly abandoned, and that nobody ever asked. You notice that the achievements you were most eager to mention are the ones that mattered least, and that the things you are actually proud of are almost impossible to mention at all without diminishing them. And you begin to suspect that the compulsion to be seen was never really about the other people. It was about not being certain, on the inside, that you were solid, and needing regular confirmation from the outside that you were. Which is why the quietest confidence is not the kind that impresses a room. It is the kind that stops needing the room's verdict altogether. The point at which you no longer feel compelled to demonstrate that you possess it, because demonstration is only necessary when the thing itself is in doubt. Perhaps this is why silence appears so frequently around power. Not because every wealthy person holds some hidden psychological secret, and certainly not because being quiet is the same as being wise, because we have spent this evening establishing quite carefully that it is not, but because as the stakes rise, information becomes more valuable, reactions become more expensive, trust becomes rarer, privacy becomes precious, and words begin to carry weight that they did not carry before. The silence is not a virtue, it is a consequence. And there is something in all of this that has very little to do with money. You do not need extraordinary wealth to become more deliberate with your attention. You do not need power to learn how to listen. You do not need status to stop explaining yourself to people who are not listening anyway. Sometimes you can simply observe and think and wait and allow a silence to remain a silence without rushing in to fill it. Because not everything valuable needs to be announced. Not every plan needs an audience. And not every quiet person is waiting for their turn to speak. Some of them are listening, some of them are thinking, and some of them already know exactly what they are going to do next. So let the room around you settle now. Somewhere tonight there is a house with the lights off and a car in the drive that nobody photographs. Somewhere there is an office where a decision was made this afternoon that will change 1,000 lives, and no announcement was issued. Somewhere a person is sitting in an unremarkable chair, in an unremarkable room, holding something they have told nobody, and they are perfectly at ease. And here, wherever you are, there is nothing that needs deciding tonight, nothing that needs explaining, nobody waiting for your answer, no conversation to win. You can let the day go quiet. You can let the thoughts arrive and pass without following any of them. Let your breathing slow a little. Let the weight of your body settle into whatever is holding it. And if there is something you have been turning over, something unfinished, you can set it down just where it is. It will still be there in the morning, and you will meet it with a clearer mind. There is nothing left to say tonight, nothing left to prove, only the quiet and the dark and the slow drift downward into sleep. Rest now. Sleep into power, guys. Good night.